Normally, the program of action of government is a collective effort arising out of the manifesto and therefore implemented by cabinet. And once cabinet have agreed, and then those things need to be implemented, if there are changes which need to be made, they have to come back to cabinet again. So any changes is dependent on what the cabinet agrees as to what is it that needs to be done. The responsibility of ministers, though, is to ensure that in implementing those, and if there are challenges, to bring them back to the collective for discussion to see what new areas need to be introduced or to be changed. But nevertheless, otherwise the program should remain as it is.
So you would agree with me that policy outlines what a government ministry hopes to achieve and the methods and principles it will use to achieve them?
In determining that program, there is a work plan which is put out by the department for the implementation of the policy, and therefore the department itself has to implement what cabinet suggests needs to be done.
Would you also agree that implementation of that policy would also depend on the interpretation thereof by the individual charged with political leadership of that cabinet post?
The role of a minister is critical, particularly in our system. But you need to take into account that there are people who are employed to do the implementation, who act also as advisors to the minister, like the Director General and the senior officials in the various departments. Those are the people who are critical in the implementation of policy.
Well, let's come then to you, Ibrahim Fakir, your sense of whether in the past or recent past we have seen impact on policy as a result of cabinet reshuffles, negative or positive.
There's often good reason to first ask the question why there was a cabinet reshuffle or why there was in fact a recall. Because in some cases it's not just a reshuffling of a cabinet, it's actually recalling people from positions. So there's an intimate link between why it was done, the reason it was done, and often the sagaciousness of the decisions which have been made. That means have they had a good effect or a bad effect? And I think there's a mixed picture. There's some cases in which there's been an improvement in the responsiveness, the accountability, the effectiveness of the implementation, continuity and stability. In the way in which cabinet is functioning, the way in which certain portfolios are being implemented, and you see improvements in service delivery. And we can take a very obvious example from this very last reshuffle, and in this case, of course, a recall of the Minister in Communications, where, in fact, there were deep problems, not just allegations of corruption, but really serious blockages in the way in which there was implementation, or absolutely no movement, and probably on four areas. One is the question of where, in fact, you're sitting, the SABC. Governance issues at the SABC, operational issues at the SABC, the way in which the board functions and provides oversight and provides leadership to the actual operational managers and so forth. And that's had an impact on programming, on content, and a whole range of other issues. The second is the migration towards digital broadcasting. The third is dealing with the question of cell phone providers, costs in the cell phone connectivity, the cost of data packaging, and the entire regulation of the ICT sector. So you think about four important issues which actually have a direct impact on citizens and the poor. There was a reshuffle. I mean, this was a minister who came in after a previous minister. There was after the 2009 elections, Sipiwe Nyanda, replaced by Dina Pule. No real improvement in any of those four areas outlined. So quite critically, no responsiveness, no movement in effectiveness, no cohesion, no continuity, no stability. And I think those four considerations matter a great deal for why you have a reshuffle or recall. Now, in my view, if you take this very instance in which there was a reshuffle, you're talking about a reshuffle literally 9 or 10 months before an election. And whether some of these people return to their portfolios is going to matter for whether there is stability and continuity in that portfolio. It may very well be that you've got senior bureaucrats who know the terrain, who know what they're supposed to do, can brief the minister, and the minister can provide political leadership. But there must be an element of continuity because there's a period of adaptability, a period of developing a working routine, developing subject familiarity. That takes time. And if you've got pressing issues like in the Ministry of Communications, time is of the essence.
Mm-hmm. And precisely on that point, I mean, those who express skepticism, for instance, on on why there are certain reshuffles, cite the issue of political expediency versus policy leadership. And we heard a lot of that rhetoric post-Polokwane, that of continuity and change. But that would all depend on very strategic sectors and even portfolios, whether you implement continuity or change in policy.
Well, I think there's also a third element, and that's the element of transparency, Tipiso. And I think if you have a government who's literally telling you, actually, we don't owe you any explanations for why we've made a reshuffle, then we're sitting here making deep speculations on the balance between policy leadership and political reward. We're not sure why decisions are made, and we left speculating whether in some instances it is about the question of political reward, and in some instances it's literally punishment, and in other instances it is about political leadership. Now I think if you take two of these portfolios, empirically in the last cabinet reshuffle and recall, I think in the Ministry of Communications and in the Ministry of Traditional Leadership and Cooperative Governance, or Cooperative Governance and Traditional Leadership, I think it was very obvious that it was a sound governance decision to replace these two ministers and to recall the sitting ministers at the time, simply because there was no serious movement in those two portfolios. I've outlined what happened in communications. Now, if you take cooperative governance and traditional leadership, they've had literally 4 turnaround strategies over the last 3 years. They've had instability in the political leadership because you had one minister who had to be recalled and then subsequently passed away, replaced by a minister, didn't actually see any implementation on any of those turnaround strategies, deep problems in communities. Literally one on average would come out on the streets every week. So you're talking about 4 or 5 protests around the country a month. You've got serious problems in the way in which the department actually oversees municipalities. Now, of course, there's certain interventions which have been made under the Constitution where municipalities aren't functioning. You've got interventions in provinces. But has that been enough? Has there been sufficient responsiveness to communities? No, there isn't. So in those instances, I think there were good, sound governance policy decisions made. In other instances where there ought to have been a reshuffle or a recall, and we can talk about those portfolios, there was no such decision being made. And in one instance, there's the perception, because government doesn't communicate, that the minister was removed because it's punishment for being on the wrong side of the ANC's internal Mangaung hangover. Now, it may be completely wrong. The speculation may be incorrect, but if a government refused to speak to its people and its citizens, then they simply left speculating.
Okay, we'll get the minister to talk to that point in just a moment. But Professor Fikeni, let me come to you. The minister spoke about ministerial advisors who are tasked with ensuring that policy is implemented. Now, would you say if ministers are moved around, therefore their advisors, that impacts on the institutional memory of a department and its ability to effectively implement that policy?
Without any doubt, Tsepiso. In fact, one of South Africa's major problems, which has been identified even by the governing party itself, is the fact that we do have a series of good policies, but the policy turnover is very high. And one of the reasons identified in each one of the 2 last national congresses is the one of the changing ministers, which is followed by changing policies, and very often it leads to the change with the DGs and the senior managers, and that obliterates institutional memory, and there is empirical evidence to this effect.
And which departments would you single out as attesting to this?
Well, there are many departments. You take the one that Ibrahim has mentioned, the cooperative governance. Shiteka has national consultations, just to single one case, and they come up with a turnaround strategy. He leaves the office. The emphasis on the turnaround starts dying down, and it's no more. And then a new person comes in, new strategies, new emphasis, new personnel comes in. Same with the Department of Education. Kadas Mal had opted and campaigned very strongly for measures, closure of colleges. He leaves the scene. Some of the measures are being reversed, reviewed, and there is a policy regret that such things had ever taken place. And when the blame for such things was taking place, it was pointed towards Kadasmal, because even where you have collective decisions by cabinet, they are often sponsored by, advocated by the ministers.
The point that Ibrahim Fakir was mentioning earlier on, and of course he can come in at a later stage and perhaps put it in a better sense if I'm getting it wrong, but what he was saying is precisely that. The fact that cabinet reshuffles, there is no information as to whether or not they are linked to performance, that the government or the president doesn't take us into his confidence and say, actually, in line with government objectives, this has not been achieved or this has been achieved, so-and-so has performed well, therefore.
But as I said, our system, as you know, is a matter which was debated quite interestingly during the time when the Constitution was drafted, as to whether when the President appoints ministers or the Premier appoint MECs, do you have to give reasons as to why you're appointing a particular one, because each and every member of Parliament or member of the legislature is eligible to be appointed. But you can't appoint everybody. But what reasons do you give for the appointment? And it is those reasons which you give for the which you take for appointments, which probably influence the decision to remove somebody from responsibility. And that is why that part of that has been, the Constitution itself has been very clear that that's the prerogative of the President or the Premier to do the appointment.
The minister is saying that the prerogative of the president to choose cabinet ministers is in fact protected by the Constitution. It was negotiated during the draft of the Constitution. I want to talk about the rationale behind that, and perhaps if we can also look at that vis-a-vis the importance of having a layer of technocrats within a department to ensure that should there be a change of the political head, the policy continuity is then ensured.
I would say that what is most important in this case is the fact that even though the Constitution's intention was to make sure that the courtesies are exercised and there was no, humiliation of people as they are released because they may be deployed somewhere. So those political courtesies, but there's still a reason to talk about accountability, especially in the most obvious cases where, for example, like Dinapule, there was a joint ethics committee, an investigation had taken place, or in the case of Shikeka, where Tulima Donzela's report, had come out and so forth, and many others. So in this particular instance, I do think that if in those cases a direct explanation as to why people were being relieved was provided, it would raise the level and the bar in terms of accountability, but also would send a very strong message on the issue of fighting mismanagement as well as corruption. But for as long as we dodge and duck, then it remains opaque, conspiracy theories are abound, and all those things tend to cloud, the space. Whilst it is understood the sensitivity of saying when you reshuffle, I've released so-and-so because of, I've taken so-and-so because of, it's not to that extent, but there are very specific, obvious cases.
I'm going to take calls 0891 104 208 in just a moment. Just a final question on this particular issue, Professor Figeni. What is the impact on policy turnover when there are new ministers in a period which one might even consider unnecessary?
Well, the first one, remember that it's a mixed bag because you take Nkosazana Zuma in your reshuffle into Home Affairs, then things turn for better, and that's what we're always hoping for. But in a majority of other cases, the discontinuity is such that when you implement a new policy, you spend money, sometimes in billions, in areas like education. When you discontinue that policy, you spend money. And besides, you do not develop people who are confident and comfortable of their expertise on any given subject, because they know that any policy document has a very short shelf life. And that in itself could be a big problem.
So it's something that seems to bother people. I mean, the SMSs here are saying that does government adequately, if at all, report back to the people, civil society, that this minister is performing or not performing in line with these set objectives?
Firstly, thank you very much. I think people have made very, very important and interesting comments. But I think there are two issues which overarch everything. There's likely to be this. It seems to me that there is a confusion between policy and the implementation of policy. Now, in terms of our system, the policies of government, as you would know, they're adopted in the ANC policy conference and then the national conference in the instance where the ANC is the ruling party as it is now. And it is those which are transformed into manifestos and then into the program of government. For you to change that, you will have to go to an ANC conference for that to be changed.
Just to round off quickly, Ibrahim Fakir, the question of the efficacy of reshuffles comes up time and time again. The question was asked about competent bureaucrats. The question is, do we have that in South Africa?